Good morning, good day, or good evening, wherever you are. After having gone through every single commander, I decided to share my enthusiasm for those cards that immediately made me fall in love. And today, I welcome you to the last part of the monocolored commanders before we finally move on to the two-color combinations. And while green is the last monocolor of the series, it is certainly not the least. Be it group hug, combo, or aggro, I am certain there is something for everyone in today's video. And if you don't want to miss out on future iterations of the series, feel free to subscribe. So, whether you're listening to this on a walk, while commuting to work, or while doing the dishes, get comfortable and enjoy. Let's kick the list off with A like Ave Progenitor Ooze, a 5-mana 2/2 legendary ooze. Ave has Storm, which is pretty rare on a creature, and to be exact, I believe it to be the only creature that has Storm. Storm on a creature works, of course, a little different than Storm on a spell, because you get to copy Ave and then put a token into play for each time you copied Ave on the stack. Now, of course, if those were just normal copies, this card wouldn't work as intended, so the second line of text is Ave isn't legendary if it's a token. So you can have multiple Aves, the tokens just aren't legendary. The third line of text is Ave enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each other ooze you control. Now, obviously, Ave kind of enables itself, because the more token copies you make, the bigger your actual Ave gets, as it is the last one that enters the battlefield. But, to my surprise, there are quite a few cards that are or create oozes. Some of them, like Biowaste Blob or Biogenic Ooze, are actually pretty decent. But of course, if you want to take it to an extreme, maybe you should look more into a mono green storm type direction that just finishes off your opponents in one fell swoop. Enthusa, Citizen Hero, is a 5-mana 4/5 human warrior. It has a heroic keyword, which makes it so whenever you cast a spell that targets Enthusa, up to 3 target lands you control each become 2/2 warrior creatures until end of turn. They're still lands. When I read this, it immediately made me think of a combo deck that used to exist in Modern, where you would use Mana Dorks and Jeskai Ascendancy to repeatedly cast cantrips and untap your Mana Dorks. Now that your lands are creatures, you can utilize a lot of effects that untap creatures, which can be quite a bit easier than untapping lands, using effects like Mobilize, and maybe you could even use it to storm off in your Ave deck. Arazta of the Endless Web is a 4-mana legendary enchantment creature and a 3/5 to boot. It has reach because it's a spider, and whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery spell, you get to create a 1/2 green spider creature token with reach. So it's pretty straightforward, it's just Spider Tribal, but maybe you just hate those pesky blue and white players that try to interact with you on your turn. And hey, if your commander gets Swords to Plowshared, at least you get a 1/2 green spider creature token. That's something, I guess. We've had a commander that turns your lands into creatures, but what about a commander that turns your creatures into lands? I present to you Ashaya Soul of the Wild, a 5-mana XX, where X is equal to the number of lands you control. Ashaya also makes it so non-token creatures you control are forest lands in addition to their other types. So, you get to turn every creature you control into something that taps for green. This can be incredibly powerful, just remember that it has to be non-token creatures, otherwise this card would be kinda silly, let's be honest. Notable interactions are, of course, Landfall. Cards like Lotus Cobra or Bristly Bill or Evolution Sage go pretty insane with this because every non-token creature will trigger Landfall as long as Ashaya is in play. Next on the list, maybe a bit more niche, is Baru Wormspeaker, a 4-mana 3/3 human druid. Its first line of text is worms you control get +2/+2 and have trample. It also has a second ability, which is equally strong. For 8 mana and tapping, you get to create a 4/4 green worm creature token. This ability costs X less to activate, where X is the greatest power among worms you control. Ah yes, the greatest tribe Magic has ever seen, Worm Tribal. All jokes aside, I really like the second ability Baru has, especially since as long as you have just a 1/1 worm, Baru immediately gives it +2/+2, so the second ability would cost 3 less. But of course, we're aiming to put 5 power worms into play, so we can just for 1 and tap, create a 4/4 green worm token. Most worms are pretty strong by themselves, so cards like Garruk's Uprising really tie the deck together. In case Arasta didn't hate on instant speed abuses enough, maybe you should put Dosen, the Falling Leaf, into your deck. He's a 3-mana 2/2 human monk from Kamigawa and is pretty simple. Players can play spells only during their own turns. That's it. It's a 2/2 that makes it so no instants can be cast during other people's turns. If you just want peace and quiet and want to swing with your team of worms without anyone settling your wreckage and ruining your day, Dosen is your guy. A bit more well-known and a lot stronger is Finn the Fangbearer. Finn has a super unique effect that makes him pretty desirable. He's a 2-mana 1/3, so a pretty cheap commander. It also has Death Touch, so it trades up if you need to. But really what we care about is of course the second ability. Whenever a creature you control with Death Touch deals combat damage to a player, that player gets 2 poison counters. And of course, the same effect as with Infect applies, so whenever a player has 10 or more poison counters, they lose the game. Finally, a way to turn all those draft chaff Death Touch creatures into a real deck. There is so many 1 or 2 mana, mostly snakes, that have Death Touch and are just waiting for a card to make them useful in Commander, and Finn is just that. He is maybe a little egregious, depending on the power level of your table, and most people do not like Infect very much. But let's be honest, you get to play super dorky cards that are never ever viable in any other setting, so maybe your table can forgive you for playing Infect. Another unique effect, but probably not quite as strong, is Glissa Sunseeker, a 4-mana 3/2 from Mirrodin. Glissa is an elf and has First Strike. It also has an activated ability where she just needs to tap to destroy target artifact if its mana value is equal to the amount of unspent mana you have. This is so strange. To activate this ability, you don't really need to pay mana, but you need to float mana equal to the converted mana cost of the artifact that you want to destroy, which means you need to spend that floating mana, otherwise it's gonna be lost. You could use this ability fairly with cards like Viridian Revel and profit that way, but of course with an ability like that, we're kind of looking for a way to break it. So let me introduce to you cards like Liquid Metal Coating to turn opponents' lands into artifacts and just tap Glissa to destroy them. Ooh boy, you're probably not gonna make friends, but it's always a bit easier to get away with stuff like that if your commander is as niche as Glissa is. Grothama All-Devouring is a 5-mana 10/8, and that's pretty crazy stats, so let's look for a downside. Other creatures have, whenever this creature attacks, you may have it fight Grothama All-Devouring, so also your opponent's creatures, keep that in mind. When Grothama leaves the battlefield, each player draws cards equal to the amount of damage dealt to Grothama this turn by sources they control. This is so much fun. I love this commander. Just imagine baiting someone into attacking and fighting Grothama with all their creatures because they want to draw cards, they need it. And then you just pump it for a bunch or play a regenerate effect on it. And not only do they lose all their creatures, they don't even get to draw anything as compensation. This spiel of, oh, maybe I'm gonna play something, maybe I'm not, is already really fun. But of course, you can use this effect by yourself with cards like Broodhatch Nantuko, which makes it so you create tokens equal to the amount of damage it has taken. So, a commander deck you can take in different directions and that promises fun from the get-go. Gwenna Eyes of Gaia is a 3-mana 2/3 that taps for 2 mana in any combination of colors. Restriction is, you only get to spend this mana on creature spells or activate abilities of creatures. It also has the additional effect of, whenever you cast a creature spell with power 5 or greater, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it and then untap it. The reason why I think this is such a strong and cool card is green already has loads of cards that ramp you from 1 to 3 mana, which makes it so this commander is playable on turn 2. And then starting turn 3, if you hit your third land drop, your turn 1 mana dork still lives, and you have Gwenna in play, you will have 6 mana, which is something that only a Soul Ring into Arcane Signet start can do, and those are pretty broken and everybody hates to see it. And then on turn 3, you can cast something that has power 5 or greater, untap Gwenna, and maybe even play a 2-drop to boot. Huatu sounds like someone who should definitely start a podcast, but instead this 3 mana 1/2 puts target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. Activate this ability only during your turn before attackers are declared. Now this effect might seem very strange and a little fair, boring and useless at first, but green has quite a few ways to break them. Let's just imagine a world where you put Cultivator Colossus into your graveyard and then you put it on top. You follow this up by playing a Zoologist in main phase 2 and immediately putting this super expensive, super strong creature into play. You could also pair this with repeated effects like Descendant's Path to really abuse this super strong ability. This wouldn't be a list made by me without a human samurai from Kamigawa. It's Isao Enlightened Bushi, a 3 mana 2/1 that has Bushido 2. Bushido 2 makes it so whenever this blocks or becomes blocked, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. And for the first time, I believe, in these videos, I will say on Isao, this ability is not wasted. It also has a secondary strong ability because for just 2 generic mana, you get to regenerate target samurai, including, of course, Isao himself. As a nice added bonus, sprinkled on top, Isao cannot be counters. What I like about Isao is while there are not many great samurai, this works perfectly on its own as a Voltron commander because it brings one of the best attributes a Voltron commander can have to the table already. Regenerating a commander is extremely powerful because it makes it so you kind of have indestructible already. And in the world of Voltron commanders, amongst haste, protection, and indestructible, regenerate fits into those category of extremely strong keywords. It is way easier to get your commander some power and toughness and maybe some trample than it is to make it immune to kill spells. While regenerate doesn't get rid of all of your problems, it solves quite a few of them. And as I said, Bushido actually matters here. Having a 4/3 that can just swing at someone makes it so you don't have to regenerate every time someone blocks with a 1/1 spirit token, and yeah, is a nice added bonus. By the way, there aren't all that many green samurai, but one actually made the list and you'll see it later on. And by later on, I mean right now, because Iwamori of the Open Fist is next in the alphabet. It's a 4 mana 5/5 that has one purpose and one purpose only. It's a group hug commander. Besides the trample, which is nice, when Iwamori of the Open Fist enters the battlefield, each opponent may put a legendary creature card from his or her hand onto the battlefield. I'ma be honest here, I have no idea how to break this or what to do with this, besides being very nice to your opponent. But hey, maybe that's something you enjoy, and maybe this is a card you can put in your group hug deck with a commander that I will present to you later on. Next on the list is a commander that fits into the same type of deck as many before it. Joral, Empress of Beasts, is a human shapeshifter 3/3. For 3 mana and tap and discarding 2 cards, all lands target player controls become 3/3 creatures until end of turn. They are still lands. Joral is actually of a cycle of spell shapers that all have a pretty powerful ability, but you have to discard 2 cards from your hand, which is a very steep cost admittedly. But the effect kind of makes up for it in my opinion. At first you might think, well, I mean, Anthusa just mostly does a better job, right? But what makes this ability very different is that you get to target any player. So, in a hypothetical scenario where someone plays a board wipe and you want to be really mean, just turn all their lands into 3/3 creatures. They just Armageddon themselves. You of course still have the option of turning your own creatures into 3/3s until end of turn, and unlike Anthusa, it turns all of your lands into 3/3s immediately, not just one by one. So, while the activation cost is a lot steeper, I think the effect is also a lot stronger and it's more flexible, which I think makes it deserve a spot on the list. And hey, maybe you could even play this, Anthusa and Glissa all in the same deck. The second Voltron commander on the list will be Kosei Penitent Warlord, a 3-mana 0/5, which are strange stats for a Voltron commander, but the ability will give some context. As long as Kosei Penitent Warlord is enchanted, equipped, and has a counter on it, Kosei has the following ability. Whenever Kosei Penitent Warlord deals combat damage to an opponent, you draw that many cards, and Kosei deals that much damage to each other opponent. Holy moly, let that sink in. This is another one of those commanders that have a really steep deck building restriction. Just suiting up your commander with equipments, or just suiting them up with enchantments, is a lot easier than putting enchantments, equipments, and counters on it. But let's be honest, the ability is just crazy, making it so you hit every opponent at the same time, and also drawing that many cards. Imagine just hitting someone for 4. 4/5 is not crazy or unreasonable to think you'll reach, and then drawing 4 cards? Woo! Oftentimes, these monocolored decks have problems with card draw, but this solves a lot of the issue that green has with keeping up in cards. There's also cards that make it quite a bit easier to reach the deck building restrictions. There's cards like Hydra's Growth, which are enchantments, but also provide counters. Or Forced Adaptation, which kind of does the same. There is artifact versions of this, and there's even lands that can provide counters. So I'm sure you'll find a way to turn on the ability and make the ogre go brrr really hard. If you have someone at your table who already knows of Fynn and has a deck that annoys you really badly, just play Melira, Sylvok Outcast. It's also a 2-mana creature and a 2/2, and it hates Fynn, it really does. This Human Scout makes it so you can't get poison counters. It also makes it so your creatures can't have -1/-1 counters placed on them. And it makes it so creatures your opponents control lose Infect. Of course, this card isn't on the list as just a way to hate on Fynn. What we're looking at is really the second part of this card's abilities. Creatures you control can't have -1/-1 counters placed on them. This makes it so creatures with Persist just will never ever enter with -1/-1 counters, making you able to sacrifice them repeatedly and just go infinite from there. Multani Yavimaya's avatar is a 6-mana 0/0. It has Reach and Trample and gets +1/+1 for each land you control and each land card in your graveyard. It also has another ability that kind of gets around command attacks, because for 2 mana and returning 2 lands you control to their owner's hand, you get to return Multani from your graveyard to your hand. Now, for some decks, the second ability might be a bit too expensive to activate. But green has a lot of cards that have landfall, so maybe you even want to return those 2 lands to your hand. Multani also made me think of a standard card, Aftermath Analyst, which mills a few cards and puts lands into your graveyard, and then if you want you can return them. Because while it's nice to get +1/+1 for each land you control, it is way easier to dump a bunch of lands into your graveyard and make it so you can just one-shot someone. Having 15 lands in your graveyard is not super unreasonable, so this provides landfall triggers, this gets around commander attacks, and sometimes it's just a Voltron commander, very flexible and deserves a spot on the list. Next on the list is Omnath, Locus of Mana, a 3-mana 1/1 elemental. We all know Omnath, but the mono-green version is quite a bit different than its multicolored brethren. It reads, you don't lose unspent green mana as steps and phases end. Now it doesn't say this specifically, and I was a little confused at first, but this makes it so you don't lose mana even when turns end. You just get to keep your unspent green mana forever, which is very, very powerful. The second ability is Omnath, Locus of Mana, gets +1/+1 for each unspent green mana you have. Now, I could say this makes it a good Voltron commander, but let's be honest, it doesn't have trample, it has no form of protection, And these kinds of effects that make it so something has higher power and toughness are nice, but I've said it before, those are easier to get from other cards, and I would much rather have evasion or protection on my Voltron commanders. Of course, where this really shines is the first ability, and maybe combining it with doubling cube to just, over the course of the game, unmask infinite amounts of mana and combine it with Staff of Domination or pretty much any card that makes use of a lot of mana. A lot more innocuous and maybe not as thought-provoking as Omnath is Oviya Pashiri Sage Life Crafter, a 1-mana 1/2 human artificer. I say it every video, I love 1-mana commanders. Oviya comes with 2 activated abilities. First, for 3 mana and tapping it, you get to create a 1/1 servo artifact creature token. For 5 mana and tapping, you get to create an XX colorless construct artifact creature token, where X is the number of creatures you control. So you get to create a bunch of small and big tokens, but it's very, very expensive. The reason why I put it on the list is mana is something that is pretty abundant in mono green, but something that is not abundant is actual artifact synergy. In green, usually green is very, very efficient in hating on artifacts. So seeing a commander that profits this much from artifacts was something that made me go, maybe there's a deck out there that really makes good use of Oviya's ability. We've had some patrons before, and mono green will of course also get a shot. Patron of the Orochi is an 8 mana 7/7, but you're never gonna pay 8 mana optimally, because Patron of the Orochi has Snake Offering, which is a pretty niche ability, but a good one. It reads, you may cast a spell anytime you could cast an instant by sacrificing a snake and paying the difference in mana cost between this and the sacrificed snake. Mana cost includes color. That is a pretty wild effect and a pretty strong one, but it gets even better because for tapping, just tapping, you get to untap all forests and all green creatures activate only once each turn. This just reads like someone that is super easy to break. You just need to flicker this and give it haste. Haste should be super easy on a 7/7. There's a bunch of cards even just later that allow you to do this. And then, flickering isn't common in green, but I'm sure there's artifacts and maybe some other creatures you can use. Of course, snakes isn't a super common creature type, and thus there aren't many good creatures, but just recently we got, for example, Fanatic of Ronas, which is almost made to play it with Patron of the Orochi, because you could tap it for mana, and then you get to offer it to the patron, and then you get to play it from your graveyard later again. So just type in Snake on Scryfall, see if any good creatures come up on your screen, and decide for yourself if you want to give this a try. Reki, the History of Kamigawa, is a 3 mana 1/2, surprisingly from Kamigawa. It's a human shaman and reads, whenever you play a legendary spell, draw a card. That's it. That's all the line of text on this card. What I like about this card is it is super open. There's so much you can do. I love that it doesn't even have to be creatures. Nowadays, we have legendary artifacts and legendary spells, so you can just explore the world of legendary cards, which is kind of what Commander embodies for me. Reki is just, to me, the Commander. Having a deck of only the legendary cards and artifacts from Magic's history feels very on brand for EDH, so I think this is just a lovely card. Renata Called to the Hunt is a 4 mana X3 demigod, where X is your devotion to green. It also has a secondary ability. Each other creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. This kind of made me think of modern Hardened Scales, a deck that uses cards like Hardened Scales or Arcboned Ravager to create very, very large threats for not as much mana and kill opponents in complicated combo-y turns. It also made me think of the new Kamigawa set, where modified creatures are a theme, and of the card Kodama of the West Tree, which not only makes it so your modified creatures have trample, no, it gets even better, because whenever a modified creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. You could see this as kind of a double whammy, as I didn't give Kodama of the West Tree its own spot, but I actually think it really deserves one, and these cards just work in tandem so wonderfully. Another nice Voltron commander is Ronas the Indomitable, a 3-mana 5/5 god. It has Death Touch and Indestructible, but like all of the gods from Amonkhet, it has some kind of downside. In Ronas's case, it can't attack or block unless you control another creature with power 4 or greater. And also, like all of the other gods, you have an ability that makes it more likely so you can attack. Because for 3 mana, another target creature you control gets +2/+0 and trample until end of turn. Death Touch and Indestructible are good keywords. Death Touch, a little unnecessary on a 5/5, but makes it so the blocking creature always dies, even if it has like a super huge creature. But Indestructible is, as I've said before, one of the most valuable keywords on a commander. The downside isn't that much of a problem in mono green, because power 4 or greater should be super easy, especially in a deck that makes use of the Ferocious keyword. You'll have tons of threats that have 4 power or more, and you'll have tons of things that benefit from you having an indestructible 5/5 that makes it so you will almost always have Ferocious online. This also works great with the fighting cards because it has Death Touch and it is indestructible. You'll also always have a card to fight with. Of course, there's probably tons of other great things you can do with Ronas, and if you know any of them, feel free to leave a comment down below. Or hey, if you have any other commanders that you think deserve a shout out, give them some love in the comments. Rishkar Pima Renegade is a 2/2 elf druid. When Rishka enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. Additionally, each creature you control with a counter on it has tap to add a green. This is kind of similar to Gwenna, who I talked about before, because you can go from 1 to 3, playing any mana dork on 1, and then Rishkar on turn 2, and then to 6 mana on turn 3, which is insane. But this card, maybe even more so than Gwenna, has upside, because any creature with a +1/+1 counter gets to tap for green. It does not have to be anything that Rishkar has put counters on. So just play this in your Renata Hunt deck for sure. Maybe kind of interchangeable as commanders, depending on what effect you think is stronger. Runati Behemoth Kala is a 3-mana 1/3 cat shaman from Jumpstart. Whenever you cast a creature spell with mana value 5 or greater, that creature enters the battlefield with X additional +1/+1 counters, where X is its mana value -4. So let's say you cast something that costs 5, you'll get 1 additional +1/+1 counter. Creatures you control with 3 or more +1/+1 counters on them have haste. Runati also taps to add green. Yeah, I mean, this is pretty straightforward. Cast big stuff, go ham, make people die fast. Obviously, the sweet spot is 7 mana value creatures, which is pretty high up on the curve, but I'm sure in mono green you'll manage. Back to Kamigawa with an uncommon 4-mana 1/3 in Sachi, Daughter of Seshiro. This legendary snake shaman gives other snakes you control +0/+1, which is completely and utterly useless in most cases. The second ability, however, makes this card pretty strong. Shamans you control, that includes Sachi, have tap to add 2 green to your mana pool. Making every single shaman into a 2-mana mana dork is crazy. I looked it up real quick on Scryfall. There's 115 shamans, including Sachi. So I'm pretty sure you can make a shaman deck if you want to. If you do, just let me know in the comments. I absolutely adore anything Kamigawa, and I would love to see your deck. Who would have thought that my mono green list would turn out to be so much about snakes? Sakiku, Mother of Summer, is a 6-mana 3/3 snake shaman. Hey, a shaman. The ability is actually insane. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, add that much green mana. Until end of turn, you do not lose this mana as steps and phases end. Of course, the second part is kind of necessary, so you don't have to spend it in combat, but instead in your main phase 2, you could combine this with Omnath to make so much mana. I mean, maybe I'm just crazy and super duper biased, but another Kamigawa card made the list. It's Sasaya Orochi Ascendant. One of those cards that you don't have to flip, but like rotate 180 degrees, which actually, in my opinion, is better considering everyone's playing with sleeves nowadays. But who am I to judge? Sasaya is on the side you play it as a 2/3 legendary creature, Snake Monk. It has an activated ability where you just reveal your hand, there's no cost attached. If you have 7 or more land cards in your hand, you get to flip it, or rotate it, I think is now a better description. But what does it actually do once you rotate it? Because let's be honest, having 7 lands in hand is probably something that is rage-inducing usually. Well, the payoff is definitely worth the cost. On the flip side, Sasaya is an enchantment, Sasaya's Essence. Whenever a land you control is tapped for mana, add 1 mana of that type to your mana pool for each other land you control with the same name. At first glance, this sounds like your average doubling season, double your mana type effect. But oh no, I misread this card at first and thought, that's probably not worth it for the cost. But read again, whenever a land you control is tapped for mana, add 1 mana of that type for each other land you control with the same name. There is no better payoff for playing only basic forests, I can guarantee you. If you have 6 forests, each of those forests will tap for 6 mana if you have Sasaya's Essence out. That is just crazy. I know it's really hard to pull off, but maybe you can help out with cards like Life from the Loam, where you mill cards into your graveyard and then return them to land, or other effects that have activated costs where you need to take back lands from the battlefield to your hand. The Kamigawa cards are coming and they won't stop coming. Seki Season's Guide is of a cycle of cards where I have presented a lot of them because the effects are always crazy, but this one specifically I think is actually playable. It costs 8 mana and is a 0/0 spirit, and 8 mana of course is a lot more manageable in mono green where ramp is abundant. But let's talk about the abilities. Seki Season's Guide comes into play with 8 +1/+1 counters, so right off the get-go it's an 8 mana 8/8. If damage would be dealt to Seki, prevent that damage, remove that many +1/+1 counters from Seki, and then put that many 1/1 colorless spirit tokens into play. Lastly, you get to sacrifice 8 spirits and then return Seki from your graveyard to play. As I've said, unlike many other Kamigawa spirits I've shown you so far in the series, I think this one is actually playable. You can trigger his ability via fighting, for example, and then the last paragraph where you get to sacrifice 8 spirits, not only do you get to sacrifice those spirit creature tokens, but you can also sacrifice non-token spirits, and spirits often have the Soul Shift ability, I believe is what it's called, where you can get back other spirits depending on the value of your soul shift. Maybe there's a way to go infinite with this, I don't know, but it's not my job. You can try and figure it out if this actually sounds interesting to you. If you are maybe one of the more competitive EDH players out there, I think the next one is definitely to your liking. Seton Krosan Protector is a 3 mana 2/2 Centaur Druid legend. While in a multicolored deck, maybe the 3 green might be a bit hard to pull off, of course in mono green, it's not really a consideration. And the ability Seton offers you is definitely insanely strong, because Seton makes it so you get to tap an untapped druid you control, that includes himself, to add a green mana to your mana pool. Seton immediately also made me think of Heritage Druid, which is, surprisingly, a druid. And this brings me to the point that makes it so I think this card is actually insane. That's that Seton is actually a hidden elves commander. There is 97 elves that are also druids, which is already enough to build a deck around Seton. And you combine fast mana with elves that have so many tribal synergies that it's crazy. This might actually be one of the best elves commanders out there, but it doesn't look it. I have built a Seton deck myself, and I think it's actually too strong for most of the tables I play at, but hey, maybe you have a higher power level table and want to give Seton a try. Shisato Whispering Hunter is a 4 mana 2/2 snake warrior. Another snake, I do not know why this happened. At the beginning of your upkeep, you need to sacrifice a snake. Now, it doesn't say this specifically, but because Shisato is a snake themselves, you always need to have another snake. If you don't, you need to sacrifice Shisato. The second line of text is of course why we're playing this card. Whenever Shisato deals combat damage to a player, that player skips his or her next untap step. You won't make any friends playing Shisato, I can guarantee you that. But maybe you like it because the effect is pretty insane and the cost is okay. There's also cards that make it so players can't sacrifice anything, which would be a neat way to kind of get rid of the downside that Shisato has. So maybe after tapping people's lands and skipping their untap step with Shisato, you need to get some sympathy back from your playgroup. If you want to do it, just play Shizuko, Caller of Autumn, a 3-mana 2/3 Snake Shaman. I swear I'm not crazy, these cards are actually cool and I'm not just addicted to Kamigawa, right? At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player adds 3 green mana to his or her mana pool. Fortunately, this mana does not cause mana burn everybody, so calm down. Until end of turn, this mana doesn't empty from that player's mana pool as phases end. This is very straightforward. It's an awesome group hug card. When I was talking about Iwamori of the Open Fist and how it fits nicely in a group hug commander that I was going to present to you later, it's Shizuko. Very notably, there is other cards that have similar effects that you could play in your deck, like Aladamri's Vineyard or the Magus version, Magus of the Vineyard. If you want to go a step further, there's also Heartbeat of Spring, which fits very, very nicely in this type of archetype. But who are we kidding, mono green players aren't looking to make friends, they want to play big creatures and swing with the team. Thus I introduce you to Surak and Goreclaw, the team up that we didn't know we needed. Surak and Goreclaw are 6 mana, 6/5 in stats, and a human bear. They have trample, and they give other creatures you control trample, which is very mono green. But the big part is that whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it gains haste until end of turn. Haste is such a broken keyword. I don't even need to start listing some cards that work nicely with it, because if you play green, you already have tons of cards in your hand that are only balanced because they don't have haste. So I don't think I need to say much more about this than go crazy. If you think 6 mana is a bit too much, maybe just Surak will suffice, because Surak the Hunt Caller is a 4 mana 5/4 that has a similar effect. This human warrior has the formidable ability, which makes it so at the beginning of your combat, if creatures you control have total power 8 or greater, target creature you control gains haste until end of turn. Now of course, this doesn't give every creature you control haste, which would be nice, but realistically you play this with a bunch of mana dorks on probably turn 3, you play Surak, and then hopefully on turn 4 you start playing big threats every single turn, and you get to give that one powerful creature that you play per turn haste, which kind of breaks a lot of these green cards. Yadora Gravegardener is one of the sweetest cards on the list because it is so unique. It's a 5 mana 5/5 Treefolk Druid. Hey, another Druid. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may return it to the battlefield face down under its owner's control. It's a forest land. So immediately what we can see is a card that kind of compensates for the fact that if you play mana dorks, you are super vulnerable to board wipes. All of your elves, all of your elvish mystics and Llanowar elves will turn into forests if you have Yadora out on the field. Now that's the obvious part, but there is a super neat trick with this. If you look at the rules given to Yadora on Scryfall and Gatherer, you will see that if the creature that is now turned face down as a forest had morph, you actually get to pay the morph cost and turn it face up. So you have a way to turn your forests back into creatures. There's also support from the newest set, Duskmourn, in the form of Threats Around Every Corner, a 4 mana enchantment that first of all manifests Dread, which turns cards face down, but also reads whenever a face down permanent you control enters, you get to search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Now because Yadora says when it dies you may return it, this triggers Threats Around Every Corner, and thus providing huge amounts of ramp should you actually manage to pull it off. During this video, I've presented to you a lot of effects that hate on blue, but let's be honest, deep down, everybody would love to have the same toys blue gets. And for all those of you who envy blue players but would never stoop as low as to play it, I present to you Yeva, Nature's Herald, a 4-mana 4/4 elf shaman. It has flash, and the neat line of text, you may cast green creature spells as though they had flash. There's not much I need to say about this. This opens up so many possibilities for you, and this makes combat so much more tricky for your opponents. Attacking someone who can flash in 1/1 Death Touch snakes? Ooh, that's scary. This concludes the last video about monocolored commanders, as we will finally take a look at the 2 color pairs next. If I left out any of your favorite mono-green commanders, make sure to shout them out in the comments so we can give them the praise they deserve. I love nothing more than reading and answering your comments because this series is all about sharing fun ideas and our passion for EDH. The next video will be about Azorius or blue-white commanders, so if you don't want to miss that, make sure to subscribe to the channel. But most importantly, be kind to yourself and others. Goodbye.